let's move on to more serious things. Though I guess like Kristi Noem, if you have her in the VP pool, it seems like you can cross her off of that one. But
yeah.
We're not that far from the Republican National Committee. And so, convention, I should say. So I don't know. We may even know before then, but we're going to know soon enough. But let's talk about what happened this week. The big story, of course, is President Biden saying that he was going to cut off offensive weapons, and if Israel goes full on into Rafah. Now there's discrepancies and wiggle room and weasel wordy, when it comes to both on the weapon side and on the Rafah side. But how big of a deal do you think this is?
I think it's a huge deal. I mean, I think I have to remind myself that I'm in something of a bubble on these questions, because from my perspective, I see it and I think, well, you already sent them all the weapons they need to completely flatten Rafah. This is at the very 11th hour. It screams too little, too late. But from outside of that bubble, there is just an absolute complete meltdown going on kind of in AIPAC world right now, where they see this as a potential hinge moment in the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yep.
Because, you couldn't get more than a few dozen Democrats to sign legislation that would, restrict money from going to Israeli units that were, that had been found to be abusing children in detention. Like they narrowed it down to the most palatable legislation that they could possibly think of, and would have Betty McCollum, an inoffensive member of Congress, sponsor it. And even that would only get a couple dozen Democrats signing it every year. And so to have the President of the United States, under any circumstances, putting any conditions on anything whatsoever, AIPAC sees as a break in the dam.
Right.
I think AIPAC knows that it has artificial power. It's really holding up its power with an enormous amount of money and influence it has over members of Congress, but that there's not much behind it, and that if it breaks, the whole thing could crumble. So I think that's why they really don't want to see any change in policy whatsoever, because I think they worry about a real snowball effect.
And I just want to be clear, that legislation you're talking about, this is not the determination of, the UN or some other. We're talking about U.S. determination of what these Israeli units had done. And so I just want to make that clear. This is the biggest ally, the most reflexive ally of Israel in the world, in an administration, at least in terms of democratic administrations, could not be more pro-Israel. A guy who supposedly, from Menachem Begin's standpoint, was a little bit too gung-ho. And
too crazy.
And it's this administration that found that information about or I should say, has acknowledged that information about those units. But I just want to make that point absolutely clear, because as this information travels. But this point about AIPAC, I think, is really fascinating, because I've been saying for a long time, I think Joe Biden is going to be, we're never going to have another Democratic president who is going to be this sort of reflexively, unconditionally pro-Israel. And the fact that even he has to move back, because what you're saying, I think, is it is a function of U.S. public sentiment. And because AIPAC has built its power almost exclusively on its ability to threaten politicians with spending against it or give money to them, there is no constituency that can rebuild their power once that allure is gone. And there's a sense that people can compete with that. And like whether it's Summer Lee, doing it also sort of like takes a little sort of a peg out of the mystique. That's what they're facing.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That exactly. If they suffer a defeat, it's very hard for them to come back from that, and then they wind up being a Republican organization, sort of like the way that the NRA became, and that means that
or Kufi for that matter.
Right.
And so that means if Republicans get in power, then they've got some sway. If Democrats are in power, then they're struggling. But at the same time, that means they're linking up with a Republican Party that is increasingly, seriously anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And, has these like underlying white nationalist tendencies that it makes for a very difficult alliance. And you're seeing that play out in the kind of, alt-right cauldrons out there on the internet, where you have an enormous amount of kind of hostility to Israel that, it often gets conflated on the left as anti-Semitism, but on the right, there's a significant amount of it that is. And even the kind of pro-Semitism, or whatever you'd call it, from the kind of Christian evangelical wing is really gross too. Like, the like, what do they call it? Displacementism or whatever. Like the Mike Johnson idea that the reason that the Christians are supporting Israel has something to do with like the reckoning and, Christ coming back and all that. Like that's a dicey coalition to put together. Like
and you can't square it with, I mean, you need, in terms of public sentiment, as you guys are saying, how can you make charges of anti-Semitism when that kind of convergence into it being a Republican organization is complete? Because, when you actually talk to, say, Jewish voters or Jewish Americans, they are not Republicans. They are overwhelmingly Democrat. And so then I think they lose control of the narrative if they lose the liberal Zionists.
Yeah, yes, they'll be at sea in a Republican coalition. Like you see, some of the leading figures in AIPAC, are comfortable. Sheldon Adelson is comfortable on the right. The ones who have kind of drifted right along with Israel's broad politics over the last 20 years have gotten increasingly comfortable within the Republican Party. But that's not, like you said, that's not the supermajority of American Jewish voters who are still progressive Democrats.
Right.
The interesting dynamic is, because Netanyahu himself in Israel has made political alliances with some of the worst right-wing players in Europe over the past decade and a half or so. Orban and other and right-wing groups. And I think there was an Israeli
Putin.
There was a right-wing, there was an Israeli, I want to say general. I cannot remember the quote verbatim, but it was when he was asked, like, what about aligning with all of these Christian nationalists? In America, their whole idea is that 2/3 of the Jews go up to hellfire. Only a third gets to sit on the right-hand side of God. That's I'm just in case you're wondering, that's where I'm going. And the general's perspective was basically like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. In other words, we'll take the support. And if the rapture happens and we end up going the wrong direction, all right, we'll deal with it then. But
that isn't that how all of us think about it?
I have eczema. I've talked about this many times. And so hellfire is just, I get like that type of heat. It's just not good for my skin.
Dry heat.
I've made it clear. I want to sit on the right-hand side of God. But the interesting thing is that in this country, once you get outside of the Kufi, bubble, as it were, and we're starting to see, from our vantage, we see it play out with like the Daily Wire and, and Charlie Kirk and Steven Crowder and Tucker Carlson. We see these through a media lens, but you can see it really is a tough balancing act to maintain because in moments like this, because there is anti-Semitism there, and it makes it much harder for them to sort of maintain the constituencies that they want to maintain in this country. So I guess it remains to be seen. But how much now at this point, when you've got like Israeli officials, now charging that Joe Biden is a Hamas lover, does he fully cut bait politically? I mean, or let me ask you this. Do you think this move is because he is aware and he's been getting pressure from Democratic lawmakers and is aware, whether it's the student protests or whether it's just a broad sentiment or what?
Well, you did see Kirby, sort of trying to walk back what Biden was saying. So, continuing to muddle it. But Biden, certainly has in the past, when he was vice president, he was always talking about foreign policy in terms of its effect on domestic politics. Does feel like there's a bit of an Israel exception to that, where he has been such a committed ideologue. My sense is that what he's hearing from his, intelligence and military advisors is just how cataclysmic, a full-on invasion of Rafah would be, and he just can't imagine kind of allowing that to happen.
And Ryan, could you elaborate on that point a little? Because I find it interesting that Burns and the CIA have been leading these negotiations with the Hamas intermediaries, and I think we've talked about this potential break with the people that are invested, like how Lloyd Austin sounded different than Blinken or Biden. The defense, the people who are mostly invested in maintaining American hegemony and legitimacy in the region are not going to be on the same page as Biden right now, because we're at a point where this is an immense threat to American hegemony, this continued unconditional support for Israel. Like, do you see that shift beginning to happen because of Burns's involvement in the negotiations versus like Biden and the Blinken-led State Department?
Yeah, it is interesting that Burns and Austin represent the factions of the government that have to deal more closely with reality.
Right.
They're on the ground, and the State Department and the president and others can deal more in the realm of like big thoughts and propaganda and hopes and dreams, and can continue talking about normalizing things, and we're making progress, and they've got concerns and thoughts. And it's been interesting. There hasn't been much reporting in the U.S. about Burns's role over there, but the Mideast press has been very clear that Burns, is the CIA director, has been playing this really leading role in the negotiations. Reporting there says that Burns himself, signed off on the ceasefire deal that Hamas accepted, and it was tweaked from what Israel had originally put forward, and people have focused on those tweaks. But after Hamas tweaked it, Burns and Egypt and Qatar and everybody else are like, okay, this is close enough. We can work with this. Now we're going to. But then there was no diplomatic pressure put on Israel to accept the deal. It was just they walked away from it, and the State Department and Biden just kind of threw their hands up and said, that's a shame, but they better not go into Rafah. So you do have this split going on. And it did seem like Burns kind of got thrown overboard in those talks, because there was a world in which Biden and Blinken could have leaned much more heavily and said, no, like this is the deal, like we're done, like this is over, like we approved this, and then Hamas accepted it, and now you're going to accept it. Like that's the United States has that power to do that. It was a decision on their part not to use it, and the payback they'll get from that is Netanyahu continuing to ignore Biden and saying he's going to go in and do this anyway. It sounds like there's just utterly relentless bombing of Rafah ongoing. But at the same time, you're like, this is something that Burns knows as well. Like, the IDF is suffering just extraordinary losses. This morning and yesterday, like, going into these more densely populated areas is not just going to lead to enormous casualties among Palestinian civilians, but it pushes a lot of these IDF soldiers into death traps. And Biden is aware of that. Netanyahu must be aware of it, unless he's just completely blinded at this point by his political trap that he's got himself stuck in with the corruption charges and everything else. But yeah, I think reality is really pushing back against what Netanyahu is trying to do here.
You get the sense that Burns and I can't believe, like, on some level, like the most sincere seeker of peace in this is the CIA chief, but you get the sense that Burns is like, this has been a complete farce from day one. Like, I mean, I think he probably realizes, like, there was never a deal ever that was ever going to be made. All of this was sort of preordained, and they've been relying on the chance that maybe they could just demand too much of Hamas, and there's still no reason to believe that Israel is going to be going to eliminate Hamas. Regardless, they could flatten Rafah. They're not going to eliminate Hamas, and so it's just a question of how much they're going to inflict. The other thing that I think is, like, we don't have great reporting on this, but there's and we're going to speak to someone who has family in Gaza on Tuesday, who's been getting regular updates from there, but starting to hear, like, and this makes sense. The Israelis control the Rafah border crossing for the first time, and in this conflict, anyway, since they've for the past 15 years, and there's no reason to believe that they're letting in fuel or water.
The UN says they're not. The UN has been saying that there hasn't been any new aid that's come through the Rafah crossing since Sunday, and that the hospitals in Rafah now are running out of fuel.
And if the hospitals are running out of fuel, then there's no way to get water around at this point, from aid trucks. And, we're going to have this is like a Warsaw Ghetto type of situation, essentially, right? I mean,
yes, and even the State Department was been saying the last couple of days that with Kerem Shalom also shut down. They reopened it but didn't actually move anything through. So what does reopening really mean there? Without fuel, all the aid, any aid that can get in, as even Matt Miller at the State Department pointed out, it can't be distributed. You can't get it to people. And this idea that they're going to move people as well. They 100,000 people they told them to move to this, like, rubble-strewn area that has no bathrooms, nowhere to eat, no access to drinking water, no nothing. Just like, oh, here's an area, go here, and there are some tents there.
Also, how do you get there? I got a report from that family that we've been in touch with in Gaza 3 days ago, that they wanted to leave Rafah, but they have no fuel. There's no mechanism in which for them to go anywhere.
Right. They just want, like, people to walk like they did from Gaza City to Khan Yunis, or like those
images,
many mile long walks.
Right. I mean, this is the those images of people at the beginning of this walking down on foot by the thousands, I mean, remain in my mind as like we're talking about the second Nakba, but it's more than that, as you're saying. I mean, like, what do you think we're talking about here? I in terms of death tolls, Ryan, like I saw, I think it was maybe not Kirby, the other Matt Miller was saying, that the rate of death has decreased at this latest press conference, and they've been taking more precautions. My sense is, and I can't stop making this point because it just puts a pit in my stomach, that when we find out the true death tolls, it's going to be staggering.
Right, because if you think about everyone that you know in your life, and we're on the younger side still. Sam and I not so much, but you are. But think about your older relatives, and even the ones our age. You think of people who are not perfectly healthy, who have some precondition or other, some disease they're dealing with, whether it's something totally manageable like diabetes, or something treatable, like we were talking to some oncologists recently, or talking to a friend who just recovered from cancer recently, but only because he was able to get treatment. And so you stack on top of it. If you think about all the people in your life and you ask yourself how many of those would be able to survive basically living outdoors with like 1 to 3 liters of water a day for all uses, drinking, hygiene, cooking, eating nothing but a little bit of rice or bread that you can get your hands on. How long would those people be able to survive? A lot of people that I know in my life would not make it. And so I think, to your point, lots of people are dying that way. And we'll find out died that way through disease, malnutrition, rather than underneath rubble.
But even
although,
that,
of course, many tens of thousands,
right,
too.
Right. Even that, I mean, right. that there will be continued effects. But even that, I think, like with the discovery of these mass graves, the 35,000 death toll is just the people they've been able to identify as the dead, basically.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.